When the world turns away, would you have the courage to stay and reach out your hand, one last time? Somewhere at the end of a forgotten road, a retired cop with nothing left to lose crosses paths with a broken German shepherd. Neither one expects a second chance. But when a quiet boy and a storm-tossed winter bring all three together, a miracle of belonging slowly unfolds. Stay with us. Sometimes the softest rescue is the one that saves us all. The morning air clung to the window glass, a thin film of October chill turning the pane to water and shadow. Sunlight had not yet fully claimed the banks of the river, and the world outside Ray Morrison's kitchen window wore the blue hush that comes before the day. Maple leaves, red as rust and yellow as yolk, lay heavy along the wooden steps, layering the porch with silence. He stood there for a while, one hand wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, the other hovering at the edge of the curtain, just watching the fog curl and sink. His house sat low on the bank, weathered clapboards and a porch that creaked even when empty. He lived alone here just as he had for years, since the department gave him his pension, since his friends moved south or simply faded away, since his last dog, Max, left the world on a night cold enough to crack the water trough. Sometimes he forgot how many years it had been. Sometimes it felt like only yesterday. Ray brewed his coffee strong, bitter, the way patrolmen learned to take it in the field. The ritual kept his hands busy. He poured a little into the old dish Max used to use, more from habit than hope. When the cup steamed on the floor and nothing came to drink it, Ray let out a long breath. The house was always quiet in the mornings, but this silence was a thing that pressed in, not simply the absence of noise. His own footfalls seemed too loud, the clock too insistent, every tick and tock a small reminder of how empty a house could be. He glanced at the wall beside the kitchen door. There, in a simple wooden frame, hung a faded photograph, a young officer in uniform, kneeling in sunlit grass, one arm slung around a German shepherd, the dog's eyes bright, attentive, as if listening for a command that might never come. Ray's hair in the photo was darker, his face more certain. The badge glinted. Max looked ready to run. He traced the glass with a thumb, following the outline of the old dog's ears, the soft arch of his own younger smile. In that image, he could almost feel what it was like to be needed, to be trusted, before things fell away, before time wore its slow groove. He took the frame down and sat at the small kitchen table, the mug in one hand, the photograph in the other. Sometimes, on days like this, he told himself he liked the quiet, that he had earned it after decades of chasing after other people's trouble. But under that, something colder moved, a knot of doubt that never quite loosened, a question he never asked out loud. Was I really worth it? Did I ever give enough? Max would have said yes if dogs could talk. But Max was gone now, and Ray wasn't sure he could trust even his own memory. He left the coffee to cool beside the frame and opened the back door. The yard sloped gently to the water, where a few mallards drifted, silent as ghosts trailing ribbons across the glassy river. Wind rattled the bare branches of the hackberry tree. Somewhere downriver, a train called, its horn low and mournful, echoing up the valley. Ray listened, letting the sound fill the emptiness inside him for a moment. There was a time not so long ago when he'd start each morning with a sense of purpose. Feed the dog, read the paper, call a friend, check the news on the scanner, something. Now every action felt provisional, as if he were rehearsing for a life he could no longer quite remember how to live. The urge to connect hadn't left, but the means to do it felt awkward, almost foreign, like speaking a language he'd forgotten. He moved back inside, poured a second cup, sat again at the kitchen table, and looked out at the world, at the dull gold of the river, the drift of leaves, the way the morning light caught on every surface, outlining absence as much as presence. His badge lay in a drawer nearby, still polished, though it rarely saw the sun. Next to it, a tarnished tag. Max, it read, the letters worn nearly smooth. Ray set his mug down, slow, and let his hand settle over the tag. He let the memory of warmth rise. The weight of a dog's head in his lap on long winter nights. The solid thump of a tail greeting him at the door. The sound of another heartbeat, steady and uncritical, that reminded him day after day that he was not alone. Those were the small things he missed most, the presence at his feet, the trust, the certainty that even at his most lost, someone would wait for him to come home. Outside, a stray wind swept the porch, scattering the leaves anew. The sound of them against the step was gentle, persistent, like the voice of an old friend, calling across a distance that could not be crossed in a single morning. Ray closed his eyes for a moment, and the ache of missing something, someone, settled deeper in his chest. He did not cry. He did not sigh. He only sat in the hush and let the longing fill him, a soft and aching promise that somewhere, somehow, he might still be worthy of being needed, that somewhere, perhaps even this day, the world would send him a sign, a paw at the door, a reason to open it. For now he waited, not with hope exactly, but with the fragile, trembling patience of someone who has lost his faith in being chosen, yet cannot let go of the wish for it. The coffee cooled. The house breathed, the leaves kept falling, and Ray, for all his years and all his scars, sat quietly at his window, watching the light change, as if daring the world to prove him wrong. On Saturdays, the little river town pulled itself together in quiet ritual. Old pickups lined the main street, their beds loaded with baskets of late apples, jars of amber honey, split wood, knotted ropes of garlic, and oddments gleaned from autumn fields. There was a gentle, businesslike rhythm to the place, a kind of neighborly economy built from years of trading, sharing, and leaning in close to hear the price of eggs. Ray Morrison went to the market most weeks, at first out of habit, then, as the years wore on, more out of necessity than pleasure. He liked the anonymity, the gentle drift of voices, the way people's laughter seemed to rise and settle like leaves, the scent of hay and earth mingled with frying dough from the donut stand. He kept his shopping list short: eggs, a loaf of crusty bread, sometimes apples if the mood struck him, and always a single cinnamon roll wrapped in wax paper, old-fashioned, no icing, just sugar and warmth. This particular morning, autumn had set its teeth into the town. The market was busy but hushed, as if the chill air made people speak softer. He noticed how the sun slipped between the clouds, laying stripes of gold across the gravel lot, the way steam lifted from mugs and dogs trotted at their owners' heels. He greeted a few old acquaintances with a nod or the barest "morning," but he didn't linger. There was comfort in the crowd, but it was the comfort of being unseen, a man alone in a town that had learned to leave him to his own company. Ray made his way down the rows, filled his bag with eggs and a half-dozen apples, tucked a loaf under his arm. By habit, his route arced toward the far end of the market, past the stalls with pumpkins and pie, past the old men sitting on tailgates, past the place where children spun in slow circles on the grass, their boots muddy and faces pink with cold. It was here in the shadow of the feed barn that the animals were penned, a row of wire cages stretched along the fence line, some holding rabbits or barn cats, a few chickens with their feathers fluffed against the cold. At the farthest end, nearly hidden from view, stood 3 larger kennels, set apart from the rest. These were not show animals or fresh stock. These were the ones no one wanted, old, sick, surrendered, or simply forgotten. Ray paused, almost against his will. He had always avoided this part, the place where animals waited, not for a new home, but for a last chance at one. This morning, a bite of wind cut through his coat, and he caught the faintest sound, something between a whimper and a sigh. He turned, and his eyes fell upon a battered metal kennel near the fence. Inside, a German shepherd huddled against the corner. Its fur, once proud, was now dulled by dust and neglect, tangled in clumps around its shoulders. A scar ran down one flank, half hidden by matted hair. Its right paw was curled beneath its body, as if protecting a wound that would not heal. But it was the eyes, deep, amber, slow blinking, that held Ray in place. Not hopeful, not defiant, just tired, like the light inside had dimmed, but not yet gone out. A tag hung by a twist of wire on the door, the ink almost washed away. K9, age unknown. Next to it, someone had scrawled, "Out of program, won't eat, unwanted." The market crowd swept past, a river of boots and voices, but this pen was an island of quiet. Ray felt the weight of his bag in his hand, the ache in his knees, the familiar pressure behind his eyes. For a moment, he was back in another pen, years ago, reaching for Max on the day they met. 2 strays, one in uniform, one in fur, both unsure of what they were signing up for. He crouched, careful, knees creaking. The shepherd didn't flinch or snarl, only watched him, slow, as if memorizing the shape of a man who'd forgotten how to be trusted. Ray stayed that way, silent, making no promises, until a voice nearby broke the spell. "Best to keep moving, sir," said a woman in a feed store apron. Not unkind, but practiced. "Most folks don't want to see them." Ray stood, nodded, moved on. But the pull remained. He wandered the rest of the market in a daze, barely tasting the cinnamon roll, forgetting the apples. When he doubled back, as if by accident, the crowd had thinned. He caught sight of the shepherd again, now sitting up, pressed against the door. A boy, maybe 11, with tangled hair and a jacket 2 sizes too big, sat cross-legged on the ground nearby, pulling bits of bread from his pocket and pushing them, piece by piece, through the wire. The boy didn't speak. The shepherd didn't bark. For a moment, Ray saw himself, years younger, just as lost. A flash of longing flickered through him, sharp and unexpected. He lingered at the edge, out of sight, watching the slow exchange, the child's careful hand, the hesitant tilt of the dog's head, the quiet agreement in the way they kept company, even as the world hurried by. A bell rang from the pie stall. The wind rose. Ray hefted his bag, turned his collar up, and walked away. The image of the dog's amber eyes burned into him like an old wound, one that never fully closed, just faded, waiting for the right moment to ache again. And as he left the market, feet heavy on the gravel, the feeling followed, a mix of fear and hope and memory, of what it meant once to be chosen, and the ache of believing, even for a moment, that he might be chosen again. Market days always held a hum, a steady current of movement and exchange. Yet at the far end, near the wire cages, the mood was different. A pocket of stillness beneath the wide sky, muffled as if sound itself did not dare to linger. It was here in this corner that the world's noise gave way to silence. The forgotten animals lay in their pens, their breath ghosting the air, eyes half shut, half waiting. No one lingered for long. Most people passed with a glance, a shrug, the quick pace of those unwilling to meet another's need too closely. There was nothing to gain here, only something to feel, and feeling was a currency many learned to spend sparingly. Ray stood near the shepherd's cage longer than he meant to. Behind him, market voices washed past, offers for sweet corn, stories about the coming frost, laughter that rose and scattered like crows. But around the animal pens, words grew sparse. Here, indifference was a shield. Some stared with pity, some with a kind of gentle apology, but most simply turned away. An old man in a seed cap muttered, "No use for him, too much trouble." A woman's voice clipped and resigned, "He's had his day." Ray heard, but the words landed with little weight. He was used to this choreography, the slow, practiced rejection that comes when something or someone has outlived its usefulness. He'd lived it himself after the badge came off and his name slipped from daily rosters to footnotes in old memories. He watched the shepherd for a long while, hands dug deep in his coat pockets. The dog lay curled at the back of the cage, muzzle resting between crossed paws, breath shallow but steady. When the wind rattled the cage, the shepherd's ear twitched, then fell still. A faint scar ran along his foreleg, lost in the dirty fur. But it was the eyes that told Ray the most. Eyes dark as riverbed stones, ringed with amber, steady and old. Nobody seemed to notice Ray standing there. He was just another figure, blending with the fence line, silent and unmoving. It was only when he shifted to go that he noticed a small boy sitting on the steps of a nearby trailer. The boy was slight, knees drawn up beneath a battered backpack, gaze fixed not on the crowds, but on the shepherd. His face was pinched with cold, a mop of brown hair falling into his eyes. His shoes, caked with dust, swung above the dirt, now and then. The boy glanced toward the market, but mostly he watched the dog, an intent, listening kind of watching, as though he understood the loneliness in the animal's stillness. Once a group of other kids jogged by, calling to each other, but the boy didn't move, didn't wave. He seemed content, or perhaps resigned, to remain on the margins. When the market grew busier, a woman with heavy arms and a blue apron stopped in front of the cages, peering inside. She shook her head, exchanged a look with a man at her side. "No point," he said. "They'll just end up at the shelter. Or worse." His tone was soft, not cruel, but absolute. The boy shrank deeper into his coat. Ray felt the sting of those words, the familiarity of them. He'd heard the same in a dozen variations, about people and places and things that didn't fit anymore. He remembered the feeling, standing in a crowded room and knowing the invitation wasn't meant for you, that the best you could hope for was to be overlooked rather than pitied. He lingered, unwilling to walk away, but unable to act. In his chest, anxiety and guilt coiled, so easy to look, so hard to reach. The shepherd blinked at him once, then lowered his head again, the movement slow, deliberate, final. A little later, as the morning wore thin, the boy on the step pulled a half-crushed sandwich from his pack and tore off the crusts. Glancing around, he stood and walked to the edge of the pen. With careful hands, he pushed small pieces of bread through the wire. The shepherd, at first unmoved, sniffed once, then accepted a crumb, chewing slowly as if unsure of the offering. No one spoke. The boy's kindness was so quiet, it barely left a mark. But Ray saw it, a small gesture against the weight of neglect, a whisper of hope passed in silence from child to animal. The market went on. People haggled, joked, exchanged bills for produce and plans for the week. Yet here, in this forgotten corner, something softer unfolded. The tentative bridge between two beings accustomed to being overlooked. Ray stayed until his knees ached and the sun climbed higher. He watched the boy retreat to his spot, hands now empty, a look of contentment flickering across his face. For a moment, Ray wanted to go to him, to say something, anything, that might name the connection he'd just witnessed. But words felt heavy, foreign, unnecessary. He simply stood, part of the quiet, as the market continued its restless churn. When he finally turned to leave, he carried with him the image of the shepherd's slow chew, the boy's gentle patience, and the hush that had grown between them. A place where being forgotten was, for a moment, not the end of the story, but the start of something almost like belonging. And as he walked away, Ray felt the faintest shift within himself, a tremor of longing, a memory of what it meant to be seen, to be fed, to be kept company on a cold morning, even if only by chance. That evening, Ray drove home with the windows cracked just enough to taste the leaf smoke and sweet rot of late autumn. The radio murmured low, a weather report slipping in and out of static. He hardly noticed the scenery, the river bending away behind poplars, barns with empty lofts, the last blaze of goldenrod along the ditch. His mind was full, but not with errands or the memory of the market's noise. Instead, the image of the German shepherd pressed against the wire haunted him, coloring the quiet with a sense of unfinished business. Inside his house, dusk drifted in before he managed to turn on a light. The small kitchen was just as he'd left it, cup still on the table, bread in its wrapper, eggs sweating on the counter. He set down his groceries with more care than necessary, as if afraid to startle the silence. Even the refrigerator's hum felt louder, echoing in the absence of another presence. He ate standing up, the leftovers cold. Half a bowl of stew, a heel of bread, the last of the apples sliced into a chipped blue dish. The television remained off. Instead, he listened to the ticking of the wall clock, the slow expansion of the old house settling deeper into itself as the night came on. Sometimes, he would let himself believe this quiet was comfort, that solitude was a prize won after years of hard living. But tonight, it clung to him, heavy and unyielding, like a winter coat he could not shrug off. He glanced now and then at the photograph on the table, the one he'd left beside his coffee that morning. Max, the dog from another time, looked back at him with the same clear-eyed steadiness as the shepherd from the market. The resemblance was more than physical. It was something in the tilt of the head, the patient watching, the quiet endurance that needed no words. Ray found himself tracing the dog's outline, the uniform's crease, as if the memory might bridge the distance between then and now. He tried to busy himself, washed the bowl, wiped the counters, jotted down a short list for tomorrow. Bread, coffee, more apples. But underneath, a different note. Go back to the market. He paused, staring at the words, the pen hovering. For a moment, he considered crossing them out. What good could he do? He was not a rescuer anymore, just a man with a house and too much time. The sky outside deepened from gray to blue to the inky velvet of early night. He opened the back door and leaned against the frame, letting the cool air press against his skin. The moon, pale and unhurried, rose above the dark river. Somewhere an owl called, its cry echoing through the cottonwoods. The reflection of porch light shimmered on the lawn, revealing the first lacework of frost along the grass. Ray stood there a long time, watching the world recede into shadow. His own figure doubled in the glass. A man neither old nor young, neither fully present nor entirely absent. He thought of the shepherd, curled tight against the wire, and the boy, alone with his backpack and his crumbs. How easily people slipped out of notice, became shadows on the edge of other people's stories. How easily, too, they learned to expect nothing from the world but its passing. He returned inside, closing the door softly, careful not to disturb the hush. In the living room, he sat beneath the dim lamp, thumbing through the local paper without reading it. The headlines blurred. News of the county fair, a lost cat, weather warnings for the weekend. He circled a notice for found, shepherd dog, black and tan, limps. He hesitated, then cut it out, leaving it folded in the pocket of his flannel shirt. It felt like a small act of hope, or maybe just a reluctance to let go. Later, he lay in bed with the covers drawn to his chin, listening to the faint pulse of rain on the roof, the uncertain beating of his own heart. It was a long time before sleep found him, and when it did, it was shallow, filled with the memory of cages, of doors that would not open, of voices he could not quite understand. He dreamed, if it was a dream, of walking beside the river, the trees stripped bare, the path scattered with bones of old leaves. The shepherd walked with him, silent and limping, always just out of reach. Ray tried to call to it, but his voice broke in the cold air. The dog turned its head, amber eyes shining, and then was gone, melting into the mist. He woke before dawn, uneasy, as if some part of him had been left behind in that half-lit world. In the pale light, he rose, padded to the kitchen, poured himself a cup of stale coffee, and leaned against the sink. His reflection stared back from the window, hair tousled, face lined, eyes shadowed but alert. He felt the ache of the dream like a bruise. He carried the coffee to his chair, sat, and drew a small slip of paper from the drawer. On it, in his careful hand, he wrote, "Tomorrow, go back." He set it on the table, weighed it down with the photograph of Max, and watched as the world outside the window shifted from indigo to the weak yellow of morning. The urge to reach out, to try, even now, even after so much quiet, pressed at him from within. Maybe it was foolishness. Maybe it was the last echo of the old life refusing to fade. But as the day broke across the river, Ray allowed himself for just a moment to hope that something still waited for him on the other side of all that silence. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel quite so much like a shadow. Ray slept poorly, waking once to the whistle of a freight train passing in the distance, again to the steady drip of last night's rain from the porch eaves. Each time he surfaced from uneasy dreams, his mind circling the memory of the shepherd in the cage, the hush of the market, the boy with bread crusts, as if something unresolved hummed beneath the surface of the ordinary. When morning came, the river was shrouded in fog, softening the world to watercolor outlines. Ray dressed in layers, the day's chill already settling in his bones. He wrote a note for himself, bread, apples, coffee, but beneath it, in a hand almost hesitant, "Go see the shepherd." He tucked the list into his coat pocket. As he closed the door, he glanced back at the house, at the photograph of Max, and found himself whispering, "Just going out for a bit, boy." The words hung in the empty room a moment before being swallowed by silence. At the market, the crowd was thinner than the day before. Puddles from the night's rain mirrored the gray sky. Here and there, small groups of vendors set out crates of potatoes, jars of jam, baskets of walnuts. The energy was muted, more necessity than celebration. Ray moved through the stalls with quiet purpose, nodding to a neighbor, pausing for a moment at the bakery stall, but never quite lingering. His heart beat with a nervous hope he tried to ignore. The animal pens were almost deserted. A single attendant swept sawdust into a tidy pile at the far end. The shepherd's cage, battered and streaked with mud, sat in its usual place, as if it belonged more to the landscape than to the market. As Ray approached, he saw the boy from yesterday, Oliver, kneeling in the dirt beside the cage. Oliver's knees were damp, his old jacket spattered with mud, and his hair had come loose, falling over his eyes. He held a scrap of cloth in one hand, a piece of bread in the other. Ray stood at a respectful distance, uncertain whether to interrupt. He watched as Oliver reached slowly through the bars with the cloth, hesitating only briefly before brushing it along the shepherd's foreleg. The dog flinched, just a tremor, then stilled, allowing the gentle, tentative touch. There was no sound but the whisper of the boy's breath, the soft drag of cloth against fur. When Oliver finished, he set the bread inside, palm flat, and pulled back to rest on his heels, watching the dog eat with quiet relief. Ray approached, his footsteps muffled by the damp earth. He cleared his throat, a gentle warning, but the boy didn't startle. Instead, Oliver looked up and gave a small nod, as if recognizing a fellow shadow. In that silence, Ray saw not just a child, but a kindred loneliness. A boy who had learned to speak comfort through actions, not words. Ray crouched beside the cage, knees creaking, and set down a small Tupperware container. Inside was a portion of the stew he'd made for himself the night before, thick with carrots and bits of beef. He slid the lid off and nudged it through the bars. The shepherd sniffed, cautious, then began to eat, first slowly, then with a growing hunger, as if the taste had reminded him of something worth returning for. For a time, none of them spoke. The market sounds seemed far away. The clang of a bell, the shuffle of boots, a vendor's low voice drifting across the lot. Here at the edge, the only conversation was in the small gestures, Oliver's careful hand, Ray's quiet offering, the dog's acceptance of warmth and sustenance, each act a salve for wounds neither man nor boy could name aloud. Oliver stood, brushing off his knees, and looked at Ray. He gave the faintest smile, barely there, before turning back toward the main path, his shoes leaving shallow prints in the mud. Ray remained, sitting in the chill air as the shepherd finished the stew. The dog's eyes met his through the bars, neither defiant nor pleading, just present, as if acknowledging the fact of Ray's return. Ray reached out, slowly, and let his hand rest atop the cage, palm open. The shepherd, emboldened by food and kindness, pressed his nose against Ray's fingers. The contact was light, but charged, like the closing of a circuit left open too long. Ray's breath caught in his chest. He resisted the urge to speak, to soothe, to promise. Words felt unnecessary, even intrusive. Instead, he simply let his hand remain, feeling the rough warmth of fur, the pulse of a creature that, like himself, still hungered for gentleness. The attendant returned, eyes flicking between Ray and the dog, then away again. "Not many left," she murmured, voice low, not unkind. "End of the week, we'll have to decide." She did not finish the sentence. Ray nodded, understanding too well the weight of decisions made in silence. He watched as Oliver disappeared into the market, his small form soon lost among the other early shoppers. The shepherd sat quietly now, eyes half closed, breath slower. There was no sign of fear, no sign of hope, just a steady endurance, a willingness to remain for one more day. Ray stood, wiping his palm against his jeans. He left the empty Tupperware by the pen, a small token, and turned to go. As he did, The shepherd let out a low, almost imperceptible whine. Not a plea, not a command, simply a note in the music of waiting. Ray paused, hand in his pocket, and offered a final glance. On the way home, the sky broke open for a moment, and sunlight pooled across the river in golden stripes. Ray walked slower, the morning's heaviness eased by something new, a fragile trust, the beginning of an answer to the question he had carried in his chest for so long. Was it possible even now to matter? The shepherd had not turned away. Neither had the boy. In that small grace, Ray felt a quiet courage awaken, gentle and steady, like the warmth of a living thing at his side. The wound had not closed, but for the first time in many seasons, he sensed it might begin to heal. The week drew toward its end, and with it, the gray weight of November deepened. The sun rose late, a thin orange wedge over the river, barely warming the chill that clung to every porch and alley. Ray felt the passing of each day in the slow ache of his bones, in the hush that seemed to settle over the town a little heavier each evening. The markets thinned further, the apples grew soft in their bins, and talk turned to snow, to winterizing windows, to the lean months ahead. By Thursday, Ray could not keep his thoughts from wandering back to the shepherd. Each morning, he made excuses to walk near the pens, checking the market for fresh bread, stopping to drop off a sack of coffee beans for a friend, sometimes for no reason at all. Always, he drifted toward the end of the row, where the cages grew rusted and the air felt tired. The shepherd had begun to meet his approach with something like recognition. No tail wag, no spark of hope, just a slight lifting of the head, an ear pricked forward, a brief, searching glance. It was enough, a signal that the world, for all its forgetting, had not completely given up. On Friday, the market was nearly empty when Ray arrived. The air pressed heavy with the promise of rain. At the animal pens, only 1 or 2 animals remained. The shepherd's cage sat half in shadow, straw damp with dew, a water bowl untouched. Ray leaned in, speaking softly, a habit left over from years on night shift, from comforting frightened dogs in the back of a squad car. His words were few, but his presence was steady, a quiet counterpoint to the noise of the world beyond the fence. He was not alone this time. At the edge of the lot, Oliver stood, his small frame hunched against the wind, backpack clutched tight. The boy had returned every day after school, slipping bits of bread, a chewed-up tennis ball, sometimes nothing at all but his company through the wire. Today, he looked smaller than ever, his eyes rimmed red, a bruise blooming on one knuckle. Ray watched as Oliver crouched beside the cage, silent, then reached through with both hands, one to rest on the shepherd's paw, the other to steady himself in the mud. It was late in the day when the attendant came down the row with her clipboard and a look of practiced resignation. "End of the week, folks," she said, her voice gentle but tired. "Last call. If no one claims, we'll have to make arrangements." The words fell between them with the finality of closing doors. Oliver pressed his face to the sleeve of his coat, the motion barely noticeable except for the quick, damp flare of breath against the fabric. Ray stood still, the weight of his own inaction settling on his shoulders like an old winter coat. The shepherd watched him, steady, offering nothing but his presence, a dog's endless patience, the quiet refusal to leave, even when the world had moved on. At that moment, Ray understood what was being asked of him. Not a grand gesture, not even a promise, just the simple, ordinary courage to stay, to witness, to step forward when no one else would. He reached into his wallet and drew out his old police ID. Scuffed, corners bent. The photo faded to ghost. He laid it on the clipboard before the attendant. "I'll take him," he said quietly, and though his voice barely carried, it rang with the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. No one cheered. No hands clapped. The attendant simply nodded, her eyes softer than before. "He's yours, then. I'll get the forms." She disappeared down the row. Oliver, sensing the shift, looked up, hope flickering for the first time all week. Ray met his gaze with a nod. Small, private, enough. With gentle hands, Ray unlatched the cage, stepping aside as the shepherd took his first unencumbered step in days. The dog's movements were slow, careful, each muscle testing its own resolve. For a moment, he hesitated at the threshold, then crossed into the open with a shuddering breath, the shape of his body outlined against the dying light. Ray knelt, palm open, as the shepherd sniffed the back of his hand, then pressed a battered muzzle into his palm. It was an old ritual, practiced long ago with another dog, another lifetime, but the meaning held, a kind of silent contract. "I will not leave you, not today." Oliver wiped his nose on his sleeve, shyly offering the tennis ball. "He likes this," he whispered, barely audible. Ray nodded, tucking the ball into his coat pocket. The moment was brief, unadorned, but it glowed between them with the quiet intensity of things understood but never spoken. They walked out of the market together, man, dog, and boy. The shepherd's stride was uneven, marked by an old limp, but he held his head higher than before. Ray paused as they reached the truck, hand resting on the shepherd's neck. "Duke," he said, trying the name out quietly, almost uncertain. The dog did not flinch. The sky threatened rain as they drove home, but inside the cab, there was a new warmth, the kind that comes when the weight of decision is finally set down. Ray glanced in the rearview mirror, Oliver watching from the edge of the lot, his figure small but unbowed. Duke curled on the seat beside him, eyes half closed, trusting at last that he would not be abandoned again. For the first time in years, Ray felt a certainty take root inside him. Not the certainty of youth, quick and brash, but something older, humbler. The knowledge that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply to stay. To choose another, quietly, over and over, even when it would be easier to look away. As dusk fell, the truck rolled down the drive, headlights flickering over the porch. Ray opened the door, waited as Duke limped across the threshold and into the hush of the house. A presence no longer missing, but chosen and choosing, in return, to remain. The house absorbed the change quietly, as if Duke's arrival was not an intrusion, but the return of a long-missing part. When Ray and the shepherd crossed the threshold, the hush deepened, and the faintest warmth crept into corners that had long lain cold. Duke paused just inside the door, sniffing the air, testing each step across the scarred wooden floor. He limped toward the hearth, drawn by the memory of heat, though the stove had yet to be lit that afternoon. Ray left the door open a moment longer than necessary, listening to the leaves scrape along the porch, as if inviting the outside to come in and witness this small, uncertain homecoming. In those first hours, Ray said little, and Duke said nothing at all. There was no need. Ray fetched a faded blanket from the linen closet, a navy one, worn soft from years of washing and folding. He spread it near the stove, smoothing out the corners, and set down a bowl of water and a saucer with a few bites of leftover stew. Duke approached slowly, sniffed the edge of the bowl, and drank. His movements were cautious, not fearful, just the careful work of an animal learning the rules of a new life. Ray moved through the house quietly, lighting a fire with deliberate care. He watched as Duke circled twice, then folded his long body onto the blanket, letting out a low, heavy sigh that seemed to loosen something inside Ray's chest. The dog's head rested on his paws, eyes half shut but always tracking Ray's movements. The mutual, wary trust of two beings unaccustomed to sharing space. That night, Ray ate his dinner at the kitchen table as always, but left half his plate untouched, distracted by the sounds behind him. Duke's quiet breathing, the occasional shift of claws on wood. Afterward, he settled into his armchair with a book and let the silence gather, richer now, thicker, as if it contained something more than absence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending an errant leaf tapping against the pane. Inside, Duke didn't stir. Ray let his hand drift down, fingers brushing the dog's flank, feeling the rise and fall of breath, the irregular rhythm of a body grown used to discomfort. He marveled at how solid Duke felt. Muscle and bone, scars and all, a presence, not a memory. Over the next days, their routines grew intertwined. Ray rose early, as he always had, shuffling into the kitchen for coffee. Duke, still wary, would lift his head at the sound, ears flicking but tail unmoving. Sometimes Ray would find him already waiting at the door, watching the light change in the yard, poised as if expecting an order that would never come. Each morning, Ray slipped on his coat and led Duke to the porch. They stood together, looking out over the river. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. Ray sipped his coffee. Duke sat at his feet, both content to let the quiet do the talking. Healing came slowly, almost imperceptibly. Ray kept the fire burning, laid out food and water, brushed Duke's coat each evening by the hearth. The dog tolerated these ministrations with a kind of dignified endurance, head lowered, body still, as Ray worked through knots of fur and the residue of old neglect. Sometimes, Duke's eyes would close, the tension in his shoulders easing by degrees. Oliver visited sometimes after school, his presence light and careful. He brought treats, a bruised apple, a half-eaten sandwich, a tennis ball with most of its green fuzz gone. He would sit cross-legged on the rug, chattering softly as he rolled the ball toward Duke, who regarded it with skepticism. Then, after a few tries, gave it a gentle nudge. These afternoons were full of the small sounds of living, the clink of a bowl, the scrape of paws, the whisper of a boy's voice retelling stories from the day. No one rushed the process. Ray made no demands. Duke, for his part, offered only what he could: his company, his silence, his gradual willingness to occupy space alongside another soul. Sometimes, late at night, Ray would wake to find Duke curled just inside the doorway to his bedroom, not close enough to touch, but near enough that both could sense the other's breathing in the dark. There were setbacks. Some days, Duke would startle at a sudden noise, flinch at the shadow of a raised hand, or retreat to the farthest corner of the kitchen when a storm rolled through. On those days, Ray simply waited, sitting nearby, letting the quiet do its slow work. But other days brought small victories, a tentative wag of the tail, the first time Duke lifted his head when Ray entered the room, the slow relaxation of a body at rest by the fire. These were the mile markers Ray learned to cherish, evidence that healing, while not quick, was possible, that kindness, repeated often enough, could become its own kind of language. In the deep blue of early evening, with the fire murmuring and Duke stretched long and loose on his blanket, Ray sometimes caught himself thinking the house felt almost full. Not of people or conversation, but of a presence strong enough to warm the silence. He did not say this aloud, did not name the comfort or call it hope. He simply let it grow, as steady and unobtrusive as the old dog's heartbeat, filling the empty spaces, slow and sure. And in this new rhythm of meals shared, of quiet evenings, of a boy's laughter mixing with the sound of the wind, both man and dog began, in their own ways, to believe in the possibility of belonging again. The season deepened, and the world outside the small house changed. By late December, winter had settled in for good. Mornings arrived with a hard, silver frost on the riverbank, the grass glazed in crystal, every twig sharp and delicate as spun glass. The days grew brief. By late afternoon, the light faded to a bruised lavender, and the sky hung low, heavy with the promise of snow. Each night, Ray fed the fire until the iron stove glowed, casting a soft orange halo over the kitchen and living room, the only defense against the dark that pressed close at every window. It was on one of these nights, after a long week of snow flurries and gray skies, that the house seemed to hold its breath. Ray stood by the window, mug of tea cradled in both hands, watching the first flakes drift and spiral against the glass. The world was silent except for the hush of falling snow and the subtle crackle of burning wood. He heard Duke's paws on the floorboards, that unmistakable rhythm, 3 solid steps, a soft drag, a pause, before the dog settled by the hearth, nose tucked into his forelegs, chest rising and falling with deep, measured breaths. Ray's own breath was tight, as if he too had been holding it all these weeks. He had not realized how much of himself had gone into the care of this dog. The meals, the brushing, the quiet reassurance given through touch and presence alone. Sometimes, the work felt like penance for all the times he'd kept the world at arm's length, all the days he'd let his own loneliness harden into habit. Yet now, in the muted glow of the room, he sensed the walls he'd built beginning to dissolve. He moved away from the window, turning out the kitchen light so the firelight could spill unhindered through the house. He sat cross-legged on the floor, facing Duke. For a while he did nothing but watch the flames. The sound of the wind outside was gentle, almost musical, and the snow now fell thick and steady, blanketing the porch and covering the rough tracks in the yard. Duke stirred, lifting his head, ears flicking as he regarded Ray in the hush. There was no demand in the dog's gaze, no pleading or expectation, just presence unguarded and full. Ray reached out a slow hand, palm up, letting the dog come to him. Duke hesitated for a heartbeat, then, as if recognizing the invitation for what it was, shifted his weight and pressed his head softly into Ray's lap. The gesture was quiet, but it cracked something open inside Ray. He let his hand rest atop the dog's head, fingers working gently through the ruffled fur behind Duke's ears, feeling the heat and the pulse of life. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fire made soft, shifting shadows on the wall, and the house itself seemed to exhale, its old bones relaxing under the weight of this hard-earned peace. Ray closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the dog's body seep into his own, filling, if only for tonight, the emptiness he'd carried since Max's passing and long before. He felt, at last, the possibility that trust could be rebuilt, not all at once, but in moments like these, as small and delicate as the first fall of snow. He did not try to name the feeling, did not attempt to speak it aloud. Words would only diminish it, would fail to hold the fullness of what this simple touch offered. The night deepened. Beyond the window, the world became softer, all edges erased by white. Ray and Duke remained at the hearth, the man's hand resting on the dog's brow, the dog's breath warming the air between them. No noise, no ceremony, just a silent agreement that neither would go elsewhere. Outside, the snow piled up along the porch steps, covering the scars and stories of another year. Inside, two hearts found their own quiet way to begin again. Time seemed to loosen. Ray could not have said how long they sat like that. Only that something in the room shifted, the emptiness made smaller by the act of staying, of holding on. It was not dramatic, not triumphant. No music swelled. There was only the hush, the flicker of the fire, the faint tick of the mantel clock, and the shared warmth that makes a house into a home. When at last Duke shifted to lie full length at Ray's side, the man reached for the navy blanket, draping it over the dog's flank. Careful, reverent. He spoke only once and softly, "You're home now, Duke." His voice was not meant for anyone but the dog, and the dog answered only with a deep, contented sigh. Ray sat in the dim light, tracing the shapes the fire threw on the wall, man and dog, two outlines overlapping, indistinguishable in the glow. He felt, for the first time in a long while, a gentle certainty settling over him, warm as breath, light as snow. Not everything lost is gone forever. Not every winter is without end. Outside, the world slept under its white quilt. Inside, a small and precious warmth held steady, unspoken but whole. By the time winter loosened its grip, the world outside Ray's house had changed in quiet ways, the same as within its walls. Snow retreated first from the roots of trees along the riverbank, then from the slate path leading to the porch. Days stretched themselves longer, one careful minute at a time, as if testing whether it was safe to hope for warmth again. Somewhere in the muddy yard, a single green shoot pushed through old leaves, unnoticed except by the three regular walkers of that path. Ray, Duke, and on some afternoons, Oliver. The mornings grew brighter. Ray woke not to the hush of cold, but to the silver rush of river water thawing and the faint, far-off calls of geese returning. He moved through the house with a lighter tread, each step followed by the quiet presence of Duke, no longer skulking in corners, but pacing at his side, limping still, but with a new purpose in each stride. Ray began each day with the same ritual, brewing coffee, filling Duke's bowl, opening the front door wide to let in the pale, clean air. Together they would step out onto the porch, pausing to watch the mist lift from the water, breath clouding the new light. Ray would rest a hand absently on Duke's head, and the dog would lean into it, eyes closed for a moment, tail thumping softly against Ray's worn boot. These walks became the pulse of their days. Sometimes they moved along the river's edge in silence, Duke's nose tracing invisible histories in the damp earth, Ray scanning the sky for changes, for signs of what might come next. Sometimes, on weekends or late afternoons, Oliver would join them, ambling up the road with his backpack slung loose, hands thrust in his pockets. He didn't talk much, but his presence fit into the rhythm as if he'd always belonged. Together, the three of them would make their way beneath the budding branches, boots and paws carving new paths in last year's debris. Sometimes Oliver would walk a little ahead, bending to inspect a beetle or to tug a stick free for Duke. Sometimes he'd fall behind, distracted by the river's chatter, but he always circled back before the house was out of sight. They didn't speak of the market, or the cage, or the winter that had nearly ended things for all of them. What had passed was allowed to rest, gently, between them. Duke changed in subtle ways. He slept heavier and longer by the fire, dreaming deep, legs twitching in silent pursuit. When startled by a loud noise, he no longer vanished beneath the table, but looked first to Ray, then settled with a visible sigh. He learned the routines of the household, The rattle of Ray's keys meant a walk. The whistle from the kettle meant tea and quiet companionship. The creak of the porch step at dusk meant Oliver was near. Ray, too, found himself shifting. The sharp edges of his solitude wore down, replaced by the slow, soft astonishment of trust returning. He caught himself humming sometimes while washing dishes, or reaching for an extra mug when setting the table. He noticed how he no longer braced for emptiness when he entered a room, how the old ache of loneliness had become a gentle background murmur rather than a wound. There was room now, for the dog, for the boy, for his own battered hope. In the small things, their days unfolded. Ray brushing Duke's fur on the porch while the first spring breeze lifted the dog's ears. Oliver sprawled on the floor with a battered deck of cards, showing Duke how to pick a hand, laughter spilling out in bright, surprised bursts when the dog's nose landed on the right card. Ray fixing a loose board in the fence, Duke at his side, both of them listening to the calls of distant birds. Some evenings, as dusk settled in gold and blue along the river, Ray would find himself pausing mid-task, simply watching Duke move through the house, nose to the floor, tail swaying, pausing at the window as if checking that the world was still there. The sight filled Ray with a gratitude so large it threatened to spill out into words. Instead, he simply moved closer, knelt, and pressed his forehead to Duke's, letting the silence speak all that needed saying. There were moments, too, when all three would sit on the porch steps as the sun dipped low, shoulders brushing, the quiet companionable and complete. Sometimes Oliver would break the stillness, pointing out a distant hawk or naming the colors in the sky. Mostly, though, they simply sat, three survivors, stitched together not by grand gesture, but by the slow accumulation of presence, the trust that comes from weathering darkness together and choosing, day after day, to remain. Spring thickened in the trees. New grass poked through the soft earth. In Ray's heart, and in Duke's quiet gaze, the certainty of belonging bloomed, modest but unshakable. They had found a way back to themselves and to each other, not with noise or triumph, but with small, brave steps beneath the wide, forgiving sky. By late spring, the house beside the river wore its age with a sort of soft pride. Moss and lichen grew in the seams of the porch boards. Bluebells nodded between the stones along the path. The world outside stretched itself, alive with birdsong and the promise of longer days. Ray Morrison's home, once a place of waiting and regret, now felt filled. Never noisy, but warm in the way a lamp shines in the last hour before dawn. It was a late afternoon in May when the three of them gathered at the wide front window, the glass mottled with fingerprints, a thin film of steam from the kettle still clinging to the corners. Outside, a pale wind tugged at the new leaves. The sky shifted from blue to honey to pearl, and small clusters of white cloud drifted above the river. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and the lingering warmth of bread just out of the oven. Ray sat in his old chair by the window, a wool blanket over his knees. Duke lay at his feet, long body stretched, chin resting on Ray's worn slipper. The shepherd's eyes were half closed, the flick of his tail a gentle metronome against the floorboards. Oliver, knees tucked under his chin, pressed his forehead to the cool glass, breath leaving pale circles as he watched two mallards glide along the riverbank. No one spoke for a long while. The silence was companionable, knitted together from all the silences that had come before, those of grief, of doubt, of yearning, now transformed into something steadier. Ray reached down, fingers ruffling the thick fur at Duke's neck, marveling at its softness, its living heat. The boy smiled quietly, turning now and then to watch the light play across Duke's ears. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the glass ever so slightly. Ray listened, letting his eyes drift shut for a moment. He heard the soft, contented sigh of the dog, the shifting weight of Oliver as he stretched, the familiar click of the kettle coming to a boil in the kitchen. Each sound, once a reminder of emptiness, now marked the boundaries of belonging. A line drawn softly around the three of them, sheltering them from the clamor of the world. Dinner was simple that night. Soup and thick slices of bread, a salad of spring greens. They ate together at the kitchen table, Oliver's shoes kicked off beneath his chair, Duke resting nearby, eyes following every motion but never begging. When Ray offered the last crust, Duke took it with gentle care, his gratitude measured in the slow, deliberate wag of his tail. Afterward, Oliver helped clear the dishes, humming under his breath. Ray washed, Oliver dried, the rhythm of their work as easy as breathing. When the chores were finished, they returned to the window, drawn by the gathering dusk. The sky outside faded to the soft indigo of evening. Across the river, the first fireflies of the season winked into being, their lights bobbing in the deepening shadows. Ray stood, stretching the old ache from his back, and opened the door to the porch. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of damp grass and wildflowers. Duke followed, paws thumping quietly, and Oliver trailed behind, the three of them stepping into the hush that comes just before nightfall. They sat together on the top step, Ray with his hand on Duke's shoulder. Oliver pressed close. Shoulder to shoulder, three shapes outlined by the glow from the house behind them. They watched as the world slowed. The river, restless all day, now moved with the easy assurance of memory. The trees along the bank rustled, catching the last gold of the day. A fox trotted across the far meadow, pausing to look back, then vanished into the high grass. None of them spoke about tomorrow, or the days to come. There was no talk of what had been lost, or what might still be found. Here, in this moment, the future was wide and open and gentle, something to be stepped into, not feared. As night gathered, Ray felt Duke's head lean into his leg, a soft weight anchoring him to the earth. He rested his hand on the shepherd's neck, thumb tracing the old scar beneath the fur, a mark of pain now faded and nearly forgotten. Oliver leaned back, gazing up at the first star. Ray glanced at the boy, then at the dog, then at the darkening sky. He let out a long, quiet breath, as if letting go of everything he'd carried alone for so many years. Inside, the house glowed, a beacon against the coming dark. The window, still fogged by the day's warmth, reflected their shapes back at them. The old man, the tired dog, the boy with a heart still learning how to hope. It was not a perfect picture, nor did it need to be. It was simply true. Later, when the night was full and the world had stilled, they returned indoors. Duke curled on his blanket near the fire, Oliver tucked against the arm of the couch, Ray in his chair, a book open and forgotten in his lap. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock and the soft, contented breathing of those who, for now, belonged here. They did not speak of promises, nor of forever. But as the fire faded and the quiet deepened, Ray felt the certainty of one thing settle into his bones. They had found, together, the courage to stay. And whatever tomorrow might bring, joy or loss, sun or storm, they would face it, side by side, with the gentle strength of those who have learned, at last, that being together is enough. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the first scent of summer. Inside, the lamp burned softly on, holding back the dark, as three hearts rested, safe for tonight, in the circle of each other's quiet company. In the hush of that small house by the river, Ray, Duke, and Oliver found what so many of us search for: a place to rest and someone to trust beside us, no matter what yesterday has taken away. Their days were not perfect, but each was a quiet victory. A morning shared, a meal divided, the slow unspooling of loneliness into something softer and bright with hope. This story is for anyone who's ever wondered if the broken parts could be mended, if kindness, offered gently again and again, could heal old wounds. Sometimes the bravest thing is simply to stay, to wait, to open a door and let another in, no matter how late the hour. If this story touched something true inside you, I'd love to hear what moment stayed with you, or what gentle lesson you carry away. Let's share our own quiet rescues in the comments below, because you never know whose heart might need them most tonight. After all, the world turns on small mercies: a hand outstretched, a quiet room, a promise to keep going, together, even when the way forward is slow.